we few, we happy few, we band of brothers. For he today that sheds his blood with me shall be my brother. Welcome to Candlewick Library. I'm Cheryl, and today I am recommending books and movies and some YouTube videos that all have to do with the Vietnam War. This came about in kind of a strange way. It was either in February or March that someone recommended a middle grade book that had to do with the Vietnam War, and that intrigued me as a daughter of a Vietnam veteran, and having hardly read anything about Vietnam. I ordered that and I put it aside until I could get to it. And then about a month later, I was on Instagram and somebody had shared 2 books that had things in common, and both of them had to do with the Vietnam War, and they were both Christian fiction and they sounded really good. So I ended up ordering those as well. As many of you know, my dad went into the hospital in April, and it was really scary for a little while. I decided that I really wanted to read one of these books about Vietnam to kind of feel close to him, maybe feel like I'm honoring him a little bit in his hard time by reading something that has to do with something that was such a huge thing in his life. And the fact that I read 3 books that had to do with Vietnam all at one time made me think there's something here. I'm gonna do a video about Vietnam, and I'm going to talk about some of the recommendations that I have. So I already had one book that I had read about 20 years ago, and I decided I wanted to reread that as well. And then my dad lent me a book that he wanted me to read. And so all of a sudden I had 5 books that I was reading that all had to do with Vietnam. Also, after reading one of them, I wanted to read the movie that was made of it. Then my dad recommended a bunch of movies. And so I ended up just in this very large rabbit hole about Vietnam over the last month and a half. Vietnam is one of those wars that just doesn't seem to get as much attention in film or in novels unless it's really negative. And so that is why I hadn't read very much about Vietnam. And every time I hear about a book that's taking place in Vietnam, it surprised me. I think there have been more over the past couple of years, and I hope that there will be, because these men were just as brave and heroic, and in many cases gave just as much as men in other wars have. But because of all of the controversy and the hard feelings toward Vietnam, these men that fought in Vietnam did not get the gratitude that they deserved. They didn't get the positive attention that they deserved at the time, and they're still not. And they deserve it. And so that's a little bit of this, that I just want to get this out there, that there are other wars to read about. There are heroes in every war. And that doesn't make war something that we hope for or we wish for or we want to have happen, but there are heroes in every war. They all deserve recognition. My dad was certainly a hero. The other day he reminded me that I had his dog tags because I used to wear this in high school. And so I'm going to be giving that back to him because he wants to put it in a shadow box. My dad was in the United States Navy and he went to Vietnam 3 times. It was a defining part of his life. And it has been a huge part of my life and my family's life as well. So it felt really important to me to just publicly say how grateful I am for my dad. And that no matter what someone thinks of the Vietnam War, my dad went there and was willing to give his life for other people. And he will always be a hero to me. Now on to the book recommendations. I'm going to do books first, and I'm going to start with the middle grade and go up to adult and then nonfiction. The first book I read was Everything Else in the Universe by Tracy Holzer. And like I said, this is a middle grade. 12-year-old Lucy and her father have always been a team, but that was before the Vietnam War took her father away, then returned him moody, distant, and missing his left arm. When her mother suggests that Lucy spend more time with her relatives next door to give her father space to adjust and heal, Lucy feels hurt and left out of everything. Then Lucy meets Milo, a curious neighborhood boy with a secret. The two become fast friends, and together they find an anonymous soldier's purple heart, helmet, and family photos buried in Lucy's back garden. How did this treasure get here? Who does it belong to? It's a bona fide mystery. They decide to find the rightful owner, hoping against hope that the soldier is alive and well. It's a journey that Lucy didn't expect, but one that might just help her answer the only question that matters: will her dad ever really come back to her? This was such a well-written book, and it was so compelling. If you don't normally read middle grade, I think that you would still be drawn in with this book and with the characters and what is happening. I loved it. It did make me cry at the end. I wrote down a few of the quotes from it. The unknown to Lucy was like a fanged creature that hid in her closet or under the bed with all the other monsters. It's important to know who's on your side and who isn't, Milo said. Milo is the boy that she befriends, and this was said as they were going around trying to get help from people, and they were encountering person after person with a prejudice toward Vietnam, but as was usual at that time, not just toward the war, but toward the men who were fighting. Grief is just a word for deep sorrow. We can feel deep sorrow for the loss of just about anything. I highly recommend it. It's clean. It is very heartwarming. It's sad, but I think it deals with a lot of the things that are important to talk about with Vietnam. The prejudice toward the men, the hardship of coming back. It wasn't something where they could just come home and celebrate having made it through the war. They had to deal with what they had seen, what they had been through, the friends who they had lost, the way people were treating them and looking at them. And they all had so much profound loss. I felt like this did such a good job of dealing with it in a way that isn't too hard for kids, but is meaningful and poignant. I will definitely be reading this with my daughter when we get to Vietnam time period again. The next book I read was All We Thought We Knew by Michelle Shockley. This one is a little bit different than the other ones because this does not deal only with Vietnam. 1969, when Maddie Taylor's twin brother was killed in Vietnam, she lost her best friend and the only person who really understood her. Now, news that her mother is dying draws Maddie back home despite blaming her father for Mark's death. Mama's last wish is for Maddie to read some old letters stored in a trunk from people Maddie doesn't even know. Mama insists they hold the answers Maddie is looking for. 1942. Ava Delaney is picking up the pieces of her life following her husband's death at Pearl Harbor. Living with her critical mother-in-law on a secluded farm in Tennessee, Ava is desperate to escape scrutiny and takes a clerical job at a nearby military base. She soon learns the American government is housing Germans there who have been classified as enemy aliens. When her path crosses with Gunther Schneider, a German who is helping care for the wounded soldiers, Ava questions why he should be forced to live in the internment camp. As they become friends, her sense of injustice grows, as do her feelings for him. Faced with the possibility of losing Gunther, Ava must choose whether loving someone deemed the enemy is a risk worth taking, even if it means being ostracized by all those around her. So, as that blurb says, you can see that it is Vietnam War era and also World War II. I did learn things in this book I didn't know. I don't think I've ever read that there were internment camps for Germans and Italians as well as Japanese. And so that was an interesting thing to learn about. If I ever did learn it, I had forgotten. And this was a really well done book. It was really good. I think I enjoyed the World War II parts more than the Vietnam parts. So I wouldn't put it up as high as the last book or the next one, as well as the fact that when I started reading this book, I did not think I was going to like it because Maddie is a hippie that is anti-war, and she's been living in kind of a family, a hippie family in California, and she just isn't very kind, and I don't really like her at the beginning. So I hesitated to keep going, but because of the other storyline, I did keep going. And eventually I was glad I did, because you do get a lot of redemption with all of the characters. I feel like it really does address a lot of the feelings that everybody had. So I do recommend it. So the next one ended up being my favorite book in May and is probably my favorite of all the books on this list. This is All Manner of Things by Susie Finkbeiner. I've heard a lot about her since reading this book. This was the very first book I'd ever read by her, and I had never heard of her before. But a lot of people have told me how much they love her, so I'm going to definitely be checking out more books by her. This book is about Annie Jacobson, and her brother Mike enlists as a medic in the Army in 1967. He mails her the address of their long estranged father. And I think it's important to note that the reason that their father is estranged is he fought in the Korean War and he has come back a changed man, just like so many of the men from other wars have. And so he left the family when she was very young. If anything should happen to him in Vietnam, Mike says, Annie must let their father know. In Mike's absence, their father returns to face tragedy at home, adding an extra measure of complication to an already tense time. Letter by letter, the Jacobsons must find a way to pull together as a family, regardless of past hurts. In the tumult of this time, Annie and her family will grapple with the tension of holding both hope and grief in the same hand, even as they learn to turn to the one who binds the wounds of the brokenhearted. As you can probably tell from that blurb, this book is full of faith. It is a very Christian book. That book was just really impactful to me. I felt so much while reading it. I kind of had a feeling where it was going to go at the end. When it got there, it broke my heart a little bit. I did cry. As a daughter of a Vietnam veteran, I really appreciated the tone of this book and the way the impact of the war was presented. I also learned something in this book that I didn't know before as well. even with my dad having been in the Navy, there's a conversation in the book about how the boy should go in the Navy instead of the Army so that he won't be on the front lines and he won't see as much fighting. And I was so confused by that because my dad was in Vietnam in the Navy. And I didn't know that that was actually a thing that people would talk about. And so when I went to a nonfiction that I'll talk about in a minute, that was one of the things that they talked about, that was the impression that most people had. And I asked my dad immediately, and he said, yeah, that's what I thought too. So it was so interesting to me to find out that people thought that the Navy weren't going to go over to Vietnam and wouldn't be on the front lines. I didn't write down any quotes from it because most of the things I wanted to write down were just paragraphs long. And the one thing that really sticks out to me, one of the quotes, would give away the ending. So I'm not going to share it on here. But it was so beautifully written. Like I said, I will definitely be reading more by her. And I did hear that one of her other books is also about Vietnam. So I am interested in checking that one out eventually. But that one was a definite 5-star for me, and it will be one of my favorite books of the year. So after this, I turned to some nonfiction. And the one my dad lent to me is Brown Water, Black Berets. This is by Thomas J. Cutler. It's a pretty big nonfiction. The men of the U.S. Navy's Brown Water Force played a vital but often overlooked role in the Vietnam War. Known for their black berets and limitless courage, they maneuvered their aging, makeshift craft along shallow coastal waters and twisting inland waterways to search out the enemy. In this moving tribute to their contributions and sacrifices, Tom Cutler records their dramatic story as only a participant could. His efforts won him the Navy League's Alfred Thayer Mann Award for Literary Achievement in 1988, when this book was first published in hardcover. And most of the blurbs on the back from other people are people who were in the war, and they all say that this is the best work they've seen on the Navy in Vietnam. And online I found the same thing, that when people talk about books written about Vietnam, this is one of the ones that comes up, which is funny because I hadn't heard about it before my dad recommended it to me. It is definitely considered one of the great books about Vietnam by a lot of people. So I'm going to read a little bit from it. This says, "When I was in Vietnam, a bunch of us decided to, wait a minute, I must have misunderstood you. I thought you were in the Navy." "I am." "Well, what were you doing in Vietnam?" After reading all manner of things, that was where it connected, where the two stories connected. And he said, "I have participated in conversations like this one many times since returning from Vietnam, and other Navy veterans have told me of similar experiences. Not many people realize that the U.S. Navy and Coast Guard served in-country Vietnam, as opposed to serving on ships on the coast." And he talks about how it's very rarely talked about. It's very rarely brought up in books about Vietnam, what these men did there. So a couple of the things that really stood out to me in this book, one was there was a story about a woman that was a reporter. I'm just going to hold this up so you can see her picture there. Her name was Dickey Chapelle, and she was a freelance journalist that went to Vietnam, but she actually was in World War II as well. She was at the landings at Iwo Jima and Okinawa. She even earned her paratrooper wings by jumping with the Vietnamese soldiers and their American advisors. As I was reading about her in this story and how these men respected her and liked her so much, I was so interested in her. So I immediately looked for anything that I could find that was related to her. And there are a few books, and I knew that I just didn't have enough time to get to another book. I'm planning on eventually reading one of the books about her, but I did watch a documentary on YouTube. I'll link it below, but I believe it was called The Woman with the Pearl Earrings, or The Reporter with the Pearl Earrings. It was something like that. And because she always wore pearl earrings. You do later find out that she died in Vietnam. That will also come into the next book I read. One of the most interesting things I think about reading this book was that with it being the Navy, there were a lot of places mentioned in it that my dad was at. There was Chu Lai, that he was in swift boats, and it talks all about swift boats and how they came to be and what they were for. This basically gives you the whole history of Vietnam starting and the Navy's part in Vietnam. And then it goes through telling stories of a lot of the people. And you get, each section has kind of a group or a mission that that he follows, and he'll tell the whole story through people's words and other information, and then there'll be kind of a summary and what has happened to those people since. So I found that the way it was laid out to be really, really well done and really interesting. It also talked about the Tet Offensive, and when the North Vietnamese did a surprise attack all over on the holiday where people weren't expecting it. And that was something that was talked about in all manner of things as well that I didn't know about before then. He talks about the PBR boats, which my dad was on, and he says someone coined the unofficial meaning of the letters to be proud, brave, and reliable. I think that fits. And then one of the things that he talked about in here was the black beret. And it said the black loop of ribbon at the back of the beret had been cut into 2 pennants. Among PBR sailors, this signified that he had made his first contact with the enemy, and the ends of each pennant were notched with a V to represent the first enemy kill. Both ceremonial cuts had been made a long time ago. So I asked my dad if he had a black beret. I was pretty sure he did, and he did. And if that was a true thing. And so he sent me a picture, so I'll show that picture with the ribbons cut down the middle. And he said they didn't do the V notches, they frayed the bottoms. And he has his little PBR pin on the beret as well. There also talked about a third-class gunner's mate who looked barely beyond puberty, gazed at the picture of Joey Heatherton taped to the inside of his locker door that he had taken when she had come to Vietnam as part of the Bob Hope show. And I had never heard of Joey Heatherton before, so I looked that up and found a video of her, and that was on YouTube as well, and it was an actual video of her with Bob Hope in Vietnam. And that sent me down another little rabbit hole of how much Bob Hope did for the sailors, for the soldiers in Vietnam. So I'm going to link that video below as well, but there are a lot of them, but I'm going to link that one in particular, showing him goofing around with her and dancing for all of the soldiers and how much fun they were having. I always liked Bob Hope because I grew up watching Son of Paleface. That was a movie I really loved when I was a kid. And it's just really nice to see people who were supportive of the men like my dad. I can never watch a Jane Fonda movie, and if you don't know why, go look it up. I will never watch anything with her in it because of what she did to the men in Vietnam. I can separate people from their political viewpoints, but when it goes so far as to harm people, then that crosses a line for me. And so seeing somebody like Bob Hope that I had really liked as a kid doing so much made me happy. I liked that. One of the stories that was probably the most touching for me in this book was a story of a chaplain. They called him Padre. When he was on the mission, he was seeing all of the medics get killed. And so he ended up going out straight into the battle, into the firing, into the flying bullets, and went around to find all of the injured men and help get them back. And one of the men, when he saw him, he says, the soldier looked at him through a veil of pain and said, "Thank God." And the chaplain knew why he had come. I thought that was just such a good story. And so there's a whole section on that. They also talked about some hits on a compound. They knew that they had enemies in their compound with them. There also was a section that was talking about a place called Horseshoe Bend. This was a place with a lot of really heavy fighting. And that was how I found out that that was the spot where my dad got his first injury. So like I said, with it being a Navy book, it probably was even more meaningful to me than it may be to other people. But I think that everyone could enjoy this book if they're interested in the whole story of Vietnam. He talked about one battle where it says, considering the low number of participants, the casualty rate was extraordinarily high. The total number of wounds received was greater than the number of personnel involved. It's so scary. It's so scary to think about how much danger they were in. It does occasionally have language, and of course it's got violence because it's a war, but I don't think the violence ever got too graphic, and the language I don't think did it either. I probably should have tabbed it whenever there was language, but I just didn't think about it, so I don't know exactly how much it was. I just know it did pop up occasionally. Many of you know that I don't like to read books with a lot of language, but that I've said before that in nonfiction I can handle a lot more than I do in fiction, because in fiction I feel like most of the time they're placing it there and they could do without it, but in nonfiction it's what's really happening. So I look at it a little bit differently. So I highly recommend this if you want to know more about Vietnam and especially the Navy in Vietnam. And then the last book I want to talk about, this is the one that I read about 20 years ago, and so it was a reread for me. It's very yellowing and falling apart. The pictures are coming out and stuff. But this is We Were Soldiers Once and Young. And this was written jointly by Lieutenant General Harold G. Moore and Joseph L. Galloway. Hal Moore was a lieutenant colonel in Vietnam, and this tells the story of one battle in particular that he was a part of, and then one that happened right afterward. And Joe Galloway was a reporter who came and was in the battle with Hal Moore. I bought this book around the time the movie came out, and so it has the movie cover. I might eventually get a copy of the one without the movie cover, because the man on the cover of the original book is Cyril R. Rescorla, and he did survive the war, but he died on September 11th in the World Trade Center. And the stories that people tell about it is that he was making sure everybody else was getting out before he did. So he died a hero, as well as having been a hero earlier in his life. So this book is telling the story of the two big battles at Drang. Now, depending on what you watch and who you listen to, I heard it pronounced Drang, Drang, and Drang. And so I'm not 100% sure which one is the correct pronunciation, but I'm going to go with Drang just because that was the one that I saw on one of the documentaries that had a lot of the men that had been there in it. So I think that might be the correct one. They go to this area called Drang, and there's a landing zone called X-Ray. And that is where the first battle happens with Hal Moore as the leader. They did not expect it to be as bad as it was. But what they ended up doing was being put down right next to basically the headquarters of some of the North Vietnamese. And they were up in this mountain. They had a bunker up there, and there were thousands of soldiers. And then the second battle is what they call LZ Albany. And that happened after the first battle at X-Ray. And this one did not have as strong of a leadership as the first team did. I have found that in a lot of the things I've been reading, the people that were in that one tend to talk about that more, about that they didn't have the leadership and it was up to the lower ranking soldiers that were really heroic. It's really interesting to read about both of the battles. They are heartbreaking because there are so many casualties and so many wounded. In the book, he tells the story with the history, talking about his memories and Joe's memories, but it also has intertwined through all of that the accounts of men that were there that survived. The way it's written in here, it says, "This is about what we did, what we saw, what we suffered in a 34-day campaign in the Ia Drang Valley of the Central Highlands of South Vietnam in November of 1965, when we were young and confident and patriotic, and our countrymen knew little and cared less about our sacrifices." On the next page, he said, "The country that sent us off to war was not there to welcome us home. Many of our countrymen came to hate the war we fought. Those who hated it the most, the professionally sensitive, were not, in the end, sensitive enough to differentiate between the war and the soldiers who had been ordered to fight it. They hated us as well." And that is what I was talking about earlier. It is absolutely atrocious how the men coming back from Vietnam were treated and how they were not welcomed. But not just that they weren't welcomed, but they were called names, horrible names. They had things thrown at them. In Everything Else in the Universe, she talks about how her dad is coming into a particular airport to try to avoid the people at the other airport that show up to throw rotten fruit at them and call them names. It just isn't fair. And so I was glad that he brought that up in here. And then he said, "Not one of us left Vietnam the same young man he was when he arrived." And that is a theme that we see in all of the books. He doesn't only have comments from the U.S. military in this book. There's also some from the Vietnamese. And the People's Army commander from that day, he said this: "When you dropped troops into X-Ray, I was on Chu Pong Mountain. We had a very strong position and a strong mobile command group. We were ready, had prepared for you, and expected you to come. The only question was when. The trees and brush limited our view of the helicopters landing, but we had an observation post on top of the mountain, and they reported to us when you dropped troops and when you moved them." They were so ready for them, and that is something that comes into play as well for the next battle at the second half of the book, that as the men were moving, that they were just watching them. They were just watching them go, and so that they could be ready to go fight them again. There are so many heroic stories and heroic people in here that it would take all day to share the stories. So if you are interested, I definitely recommend you reading it. But one of the men, Beck, said, "Fear comes, and once you recognize it and accept it, it passes just as fast as it comes, and you don't really think about it anymore. You just do what you have to do, but you learn the real meaning of fear and life and death. For the next 2 hours, I was alone on that gun, shooting at the enemy. Enemy were shooting at me, and bullets were hitting the ground beside me and cracking above my head." I think most of us cannot imagine what it would be like to be in this situation. So that's why I think it's so important sometimes to get these accounts from people who were there. And I don't think I mentioned this was the Army. Another story that stuck out to me: on that M60 machine gun, according to extracts from his Silver Star citation, Specialist Parrish delivered lethal fire on wave after wave of the enemy until he ran out of ammunition. Then, standing up under fire with a .45 pistol in each hand, Parrish fired clip after clip into the enemy who were 20 yards out. He stopped their attack. Says Parrish, "I feel like I didn't do any more than anybody else did up there. I remember a lot of noise, a lot of yelling, and then all at once it was quiet. The silence out in front of Willard Parish was that of a cemetery. More than 100 dead North Vietnamese were later found where they had fallen in a semicircle around his foxhole. Toward the end of this part of the story, when Galloway is taking some last-minute photos and videos, Moore says to him, "Go tell America what these brave men did. Tell them how their sons died." So Galloway talks about leaving, and then he goes back to, where the reporters stay, and he finds out that Dickey Chapelle has died. That's the woman I talked about a minute ago. And he said, Dickey Chapelle, an old pro who had covered a dozen wars and revolutions, had been a good friend and offered good advice to someone new to the game of war. Galloway sat there in the dark, shaking silently and weeping for his old friend and for all the new ones who had died beside him this week. It was going to be a long war. Moore says at the end of this part, "I felt pride in what we had done, grief at our losses, and guilt that I was still alive," which is a very, very common feeling for a lot of these men. Something that somebody said about Hal Moore is this: Hal Moore was the last man to come out of the battle. It was the biggest battle he had ever fought. He was a lieutenant colonel, and he carried himself like a proud man. His sergeant major was at his side. It would need a Shakespeare to describe what happened then, but it was something that was love and manliness and pride. It was the moment of the brave. Hal Moore turned and went from group to group of his men, and only a few bothered to get up because there was no exclusivity now, no rank, and Hal Moore did not want them to stand and salute. He was saluting them. He talked with them, he thanked them, he was not solemn, and he did not bring to his greetings the salutations of a politician. There was no poverty of spirit in his handshake, and he shook every man's hand. It was a union of the men who had met and defeated the enemy, not forever, not in a victory that ended the war, but in a victory over their uncertainty. When their hour had come, they had done their job, and it was this thought, too, that Hal Moore had in mind, and he said that if they had won no one else's gratitude, they had won his. And I would imagine that with this group of men and how much they revered their leader, that would have meant so much to them, especially at a time when so many people weren't appreciating them and wouldn't give them gratitude. But they had the love and gratitude of this man that they loved. He kind of reminded me of in the movie White Christmas when they're celebrating the general and how all of those men are willing to come together to celebrate him. And then you find out about the new leader of this part. They were coming in to relieve those men that had just been in battle, and then these men get into something so terrible, march straight into an ambush. One of the men that really impressed me was Captain George Forrest. He was an athlete in high school, and I'll just read it from here again. Just about the time McDade started to talk to them, a couple of mortar rounds came in. McDade was the leader. Forrest immediately turned and dashed back toward his company. I didn't wait for him to dismiss us. I just took off. Both of my radio operators were hit and killed during that run. I didn't get a scratch. When I got back to the company, I found my executive officer was down, hit in the back with mortar shrapnel. I wasn't sure about the situation, so I pushed my guys off the trail to the east and put them in a perimeter. It appeared for a time the fire was coming from every direction, so we circled the wagons. I think that firing lasted 35 or 40 minutes. All my platoon leaders were functioning, except Lieutenant Larry L. Hess, who was killed in the first minutes. My weapons sergeant was wounded. George Forrest run down that 600-yard-long gauntlet of fire, miraculously unscathed, and the forming of his men into a defensive perimeter helped keep Alpha Company, 1st Battalion, 5th Cavalry from sharing the fate of Charlie, Delta, and the headquarters companies of the 2nd Battalion in the middle of the column. And you'll find that a lot of people that talked about us that were there talked about how it was this man Forrest that saved them, with him running back there so quickly and just not caring about waiting for the leader to tell him what to do, but he ran back, got the men where they needed to be, and did what needed to be done. One of the saddest things that you read about in here is how in the first part at LZ X-Ray, there were 2 helicopter pilots, and I'm going to get back to them in a minute, but there were 2 helicopter pilots that were responsible for bringing the men in. But then for the wounded, to take out the wounded, there were supposed to be medevacs, but they refused to land because they were being fired upon. So those 2 helicopter pilots came back over and over and over again to bring more supplies and to take back the wounded. And in this one at Albany, it says this again. I called medevac and they came out, made a pass, drew fire, refused to land. It is so sad that the people that were there that were supposed to be helping wouldn't come to them. And then at the end of that chapter, it says the nightmares born of this battle have never faded. And I think that that's true across the board. The last section of the book is called The Aftermath. And in this, he talks about how the really higher ups tried to cover this up a little bit and make it seem like it was less than it was. Knowles told the news conference that a battalion of the 1st Cavalry Division, Air Mobile, had had a meeting engagement with an enemy force of equal or larger size, and the American battalion had suffered light to moderate casualties. After reading the book, you'll understand why that would make me mad to read that he said that. Another thing that he addresses in the aftermath is the fact that during this time, that with the first part with LZ X-ray, the Army hadn't really figured out how to get word to family members yet about when their sons, their brothers, their husbands died. And they sent telegrams and had taxi drivers delivering them. And as you can imagine, that was really hard for people. There's no warmth in that. It was hard on the taxi drivers to have to do it, but there was no comfort given to the families that were getting this news. And Hal Moore's wife took it upon herself to go and visit and be there for all of the women that were in her area. Obviously, she couldn't be there for everybody because some of the men were from other places. But for everyone that she could be, she was there to help them, to comfort them when they got the telegram, and then also attended every single funeral except for the first one because she didn't know about it yet. So then she told them, don't you dare do these funerals without telling me. And so then she was there at every single one of them. And there were a few other women that then joined in with her as well to do this for the other women. And they were so brave, not knowing whether one of the times it was going to be their own telegram. Toward the end of this part, he says, America should feel guilty for its collective treatment of the Vietnam veteran. And so should our government, or at least those who governed during the Vietnam conflict. They wouldn't even call the long siege in Vietnam a war because war wasn't declared. One of my favorite things about this book that I felt was so powerful is at the end here, he has the accounts go from not just the soldiers that were there anymore, but from the family members, from the children who lost their fathers. Those letters that are written here from them are so sad, but they're so good and powerful as well. So then there's a little thing at the end of that says, they are the Gold Star children, war's innocent victims, and their pain shimmers across the years, pure and undimmed. They pass through life with an empty room in their hearts where a father was supposed to live and laugh and love. All their lives, they listen for the footsteps that will never fall and long to know what might have been. The very last part of the book says, finally, even though it took 10 years, cost the lives of 58,000 young Americans, and inflicted humiliating defeat on a nation that had never before lost a war, some of us learned that Clausewitz had it right 150 years earlier when he wrote these words. No one starts a war, or rather, no one in his senses ought to do so, without first being clear in his mind what he intends to achieve by that war and how he intends to conduct it. He has a list of all of the different people mentioned in this, and some that weren't mentioned, I think, and what they've done since, what happened to them, so that you could kind of flip through and read all of their names and their story and a little teeny blurb of their story. So obviously you can tell how much I loved this book. This one has a little bit more language, I think, than the other nonfiction. And again, talk of war and wounds and things like that. Just like with the other one, I don't feel like it's gratuitous, and I feel like it's an important enough story to tell that it didn't bother me. The two helicopter pilots I talked about, their names were Crandall and Freeman. They did end up getting medals of honor for what they did in this battle, but they came later. They didn't get them until Freeman got his in 2001 and Crandall got his a little bit later in 2007. I don't know why they didn't get them right after the war, but they didn't. They went a long time without it. And then Joe Galloway, the reporter that helped to write the book, he was awarded the Bronze Star for gallantry and was the only civilian to get that in Vietnam. I would say definitely of the five, my favorites were Brownwater, Black Beret, We Were Soldiers, and All Manner of... Like I said, I also watched 5 movies, and I did not even plan that. I did not plan on having 5 books and 5 movies. I was only going to watch We Were Soldiers, and then my dad recommended Forrest Gump and the Green Berets and Operation Dumbo Drop, and then he brought me a DVD of documentaries. There's 1 R-rated, 1 PG-13, 1 PG, and 1 G, and then 1 not rated. The first movie was We Were Soldiers. I really wanted to watch the movie again. It had been just as long since I watched the movie as how long it had been since I read the book. This is an R-rated movie. That is only because of the violence level. There is some language in it. I didn't feel like it was excessive, but it was definitely more violent. Think Saving Private Ryan. It's kind of if you've seen that, it's kind of on par with that. There were only a few times during the movie where I felt like it was too much for a minute, but even then in the overall whole movie, I didn't feel like it was too much the whole time because the story was so good and it was so well done. I was able to watch it on Paramount Plus. You can also rent it on Prime. It's 2 hours and 18 minutes. They made it in 2002. It stars Mel Gibson as Hal Moore. Barry Pepper plays Joe Galloway. And then it also has Madeline Stowe, Greg Kinnear, Sam Elliott, Chris Klein, Kerry Russell, John Hamm. On IMDb, they say severe violence, but no sex or nudity, moderate profanity, and moderate alcohol and smoking. I feel like this movie is so good and so powerful. It is filmed and done in a way that you can tell that they wanted to do the book justice. And in fact, the Forrest that I talked about in the last book, there is one YouTube video that I'm going to link to where he was talking about this movie, and he said this was the first movie that really showed what and how courageous these guys really were, was We Were Soldiers. Hal Moore and Joe Galloway, based on their book, told this love story about what guys will do for each other, not for some political whatever, but for survival and because you care about the guy next to you in that foxhole. I think that one of the most heartfelt moments of the movie is when they show his wife delivering the telegrams, because they do show that. There's even a faith element in this movie. It shows Moore praying multiple times, and one of the prayers was really powerful and actually made me cry. Some of the things that I found interesting that I learned about the film are that Sam Elliott became so close with the real Plumlee that he played and the family that he sat in the front with the family when Plumlee eventually died at his funeral. Some of the Vietnamese actors in the movie were North Vietnamese soldiers. They had every member of the company represented in the film. Not all of them are named and not all of them have a speaking part or anything like that, but they did make sure that they had somebody for everybody that was there. It was filmed in order. So usually how movies are filmed out of order, they filmed this one in order so that when the soldiers left for battle, so did the actors. They had a little bit of a boot camp. Mel Gibson made a comment about how it was actor boot camp, but he still felt like it was pretty hard. Many of the women that are in the film are wives of soldiers. In the movie, you do see one man that is about to get on a helicopter, but he lets someone else go before him because he feels like they're more wounded than he is, and then he gets fatally shot right then. Joe Galloway ended up marrying his daughter. At the end of the film, there's a voiceover from Barry Pepper as Galloway saying, "We who have seen war will never stop seeing it. In the silence of the night, we will always hear the screams. So this is our story, for we were soldiers once and young." I do wish that they could make movies without them being so graphic. I don't like seeing it, but I do feel like as far as war movies go, this one is near perfect. It made me really feel, I just think it's so good. The next movie was Forrest Gump. That one's PG-13. It's 2 hours and 22 minutes. It was made in 1994. And this actually has Forrest's life from the 1950s all the way into the 1970s. So it isn't all Vietnam. It just has the part where he goes to Vietnam, and then there's a storyline afterward that is relating to Vietnam. It was on Prime and Paramount. I can't remember which one I watched it on. My dad told me that during the firefight, that with the bullets and the tracers going by and the napalm and all of that, that it was very accurately portrayed, as well as when the storms are coming in and the rain is bouncing up off the water. This movie has Tom Hanks playing Forrest Gump, Robin Wright, Gary Sinise, and Sally Field, and it won 6 Oscars: Best Picture, Best Actor, Best Director, Screenplay, based on a book, editing, and visual effects. Based on IMDb, it says that the violence and gore is moderate, profanity moderate, the drugs moderate, and sex and nudity moderate. That was my only real beef with the movie. I remember going to it for the first time. I was in high school and I was on a first date with somebody, and I was really embarrassed because of the sexual content. While it's not terrible, it's not the worst you'll see. So I would say to go in that with some caution and maybe look that up on IMDb to see the different things that they say that they show. Many veterans, beside my dad, have talked about how accurate the combat scene was, and mainly because it's so sudden and you don't see the enemy. It happens really quickly. There was a little bit of a faith element in it. I don't think it was as pronounced as some of the parts in We Were Soldiers, but there still is some. And I loved the whole Lieutenant Dan, Gary Sinise's character. I loved his storyline, and I loved some of the things that Forrest Gump said. I believe that a lot of it is really profound, especially toward the end. And Gary Sinise, actually, after playing this part, he formed a foundation for injured war veterans. And then also I found out that during the movie, when he's wearing a necklace that's a rosary with St. Christopher medal, it's inscribed with "Protect Us in Combat." That was worn by his brother-in-law, Jack, in Vietnam. And I thought that was kind of a cool touch to notice in the movie. Then there's Operation Dumbo Drop. This also came out in the 90s. It was 1995. It's 1 hour, 47 minutes, and it's on Disney. And this was the PG movie. This had Danny Glover, Ray Liotta, Dennis Leary, Dougie Doug, and Corin Nemec. So I watched it on Disney Plus, but it's also on Prime to rent. And this was based on a real operation, but the whole time I was watching it, I was wondering how much of it was actually real. And so I looked it up afterward, and a lot of it is fictionalized. A lot of the storyline is, and a lot of none of the characters have their real names. But the part that feels the least realistic, when elephants are being dropped from a plane with parachutes, was actually true. So there were 2 elephants, though, not just one like it shows in the movie. They were named Bonnie and Clyde, and they weren't dropped standing up like it shows you in the movie. They were strapped down, laying down. And there was a veterinarian involved, not just soldiers. But it was a fun movie. I think it's a really good family movie. It's very typical Disney family movie of the 90s. There was some mild violence, mild profanity based on IMDb, but I didn't really notice anything like that. There was a little bit of battle in it, but nothing ever violent. I don't think I even noticed any swearing. So it definitely was very mild. The funny thing about that is that it was PG, and the next movie was G rated, The Green Berets. And I actually felt like those 2 should have been switched. I feel like that The Green Berets should have been at least PG. The Green Berets was from 1968. It was filmed while Vietnam was still happening. And it's 2 hours and 22 minutes. I rented it on Prime for a few dollars. It stars John Wayne, George Takei, and they say it has moderate violence and gore and mild profanity. That's why I think it's weird that it's rated G. Because while the violence and goriness definitely was not at the level of We Were Soldiers or even Forrest Gump, there was one part where a man is impaled on something, and that part shocked me. I did not expect it, and I threw a blanket over my head, and I was very traumatized by it in the moment. So I feel like you have to go into it knowing there's going to be a little bit of violence. The story is about Green Berets that were special operations. A lot of people have negative reviews about it, calling it a propaganda film because it shows a positive view of Vietnam. But I would say that most things are propaganda films that are about war. And it's either that they're good or they're bad, or they're true or they're not. John Wayne said that he believed the extremely negative reviews probably helped the film's box office performance. He further said that he felt the critics were attacking the war itself rather than the film. One quote that stuck out to me in it was when they're talking to news people about the war, and a woman says, "It's strange we've never heard of this in the newspapers," because the man has told her what the North Vietnamese were really doing. And he said, "Well, that's newspapers for you, ma'am. You could fill volumes with what you don't read in them." With the violence in this movie, occasionally you do see blood as well. It's not just the spikes part. However, the blood looks so fake that that didn't bother me at all, because it just didn't feel violent to me, except for that one part that shocked me. It was really sad, though. There were really good things as well, but there was part of it really made me sad. Every single one of these movies has sadness in it. Operation Dumbo Drop is probably the only one that doesn't have that as much, but even then there's a little bit. And then the last thing was this, Secrets of War, Vietnam, A War Unwanted. And this was a documentary put on by the History Channel that my dad lent to me. It has 5 episodes. They're narrated by Charlton Heston. And the first episode is Alpha Strike, exclusive interviews with North Vietnamese veterans, secret American operations in Laos and Cambodia, and the Navy's classified programs. And that one you can find on YouTube. Episode 2 and episode 3, Hidden in Plain Sight, which is about the tunnels, hidden supply highways, and special operations that tells the story of the special ops teams. Those I couldn't find on YouTube, so I was only able to watch on this DVD, but I think they might be on Amazon. Episode 4 and 5 that talk about Johnson's White House and Ho Chi Minh himself, and it gives a big historical part of it. Those were on YouTube as well, so I will link all of those below. It has US and North Vietnamese military people talking throughout the documentary. I thought they were really interesting. They didn't stick out to me as much as some of the other things I've watched, but they are interesting, and if you enjoy watching documentaries, you probably like watching them. Overall, the 5 of them take about 4 hours. So as far as the movies go, We Were Soldiers was definitely my favorite one, but I think that they were all good. And then on YouTube, like I said, I will link the Bob Hope video and a link to the documentary about Dickey Chapelle and the episodes from that documentary. But there was also a 1990s type documentary about the people in We Were Soldiers returning to Vietnam and meeting with the guy who was the leader of the North Vietnamese in those battles. It's called They Were Young and Brave, and it shows footage from it, but none of it's too violent and gory. And it does have, the, like I said, the men from both sides talking. And that was 47 minutes. And I thought that was really interesting to watch, especially right after reading the book and watching the movie. So I'll link that below as well. And then there was one called Ambushed, the Ferocious Fight of LZ Albany. So that's only about the second battle in that book. And it has George Forrest, the one I talked about running. It has him in it talking. That is where I got the quote from. And that one, I believe, was about 20 minutes, but I forgot to write it down. And then the last two that I found on YouTube were also about the battle at Ia Drang. Part 1 was called Bloody Dawn of the Vietnam War, Battle of Ia Drang at LZ X-Ray. And part 2 was the horrific tragedy of LZ Albany, Cover Up at Ia Drang. And the first one is 25 minutes. The second one is 17 minutes. And these have documentary style footage. It's not too graphic. They show maps to show where these two battles were. And I felt like both of those were really done well. So I'm going to link those as well in the bottom. So if you want to watch something about We Were Soldiers without having the actual movie violence, you can watch those and get the story, see some of the things that happen, and hear some of the heroic stories that happen there. I think there is something here for everybody. A book, a movie, or a YouTube video for everybody that's watching this at the level that you can take to go out and watch or read something about Vietnam. I know that there's a few other books that are kind of popular right now that are about Vietnam. So if you want to give your recommendations in the comments, you can. One of them that I know a lot of people talk about is The Women, but I really don't have any interest in reading that one because of the storyline of infidelity. Based on some reviews I've seen, I'm not really interested in that one. And let me know if you've read or watched any of these things, or if you go and read and watch them after. Please come back and tell me what you think of them. I hope that this has been interesting. And again, thank you to my dad and all of the veterans out there of every war, but for this video, especially Vietnam.